Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. This is episode number 144, and tonight, some high-speed racing action from the 1970s and 1980s. But before we talk about that, we'd like you to do us a favor if you haven't already done so. I know a lot of you have. Please take a second to like, share, or subscribe and follow us. And if you subscribe on YouTube, make sure you click that bell icon and you'll get notifications when new episodes of Warbird Tube go live. Now, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about CAF, our events, the aircraft, local units, or how you can join in the fun, just visit commemorativeairforce.org. All the details are right there for you. Now, as you're watching tonight, you might have some questions. If you do, just put those in the chat box. We'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off tonight. But either way, we'll try to get an answer to your question, and hopefully it'll be a good answer to a good question. All right. If not, we'll just make things up. Right. Joining us now is Brad Haskin, and Brad, you have been covering the National Championship air races in Reno for a number of years, and you're really a fan of the air races, along with covering them media-wise, and we'd just like to welcome you to the show.
Thanks. One, I can't believe it's taken 144 episodes to get on here, but two, I'm going to do my best to do my buddy Brad Pilgrim proud, because I always tune in when Brad's doing it, so I'll try to live up to his expectations.
Excellent. Well, tell us a little bit about your background, Brad.
Sure. I was raised in a family with an L-17 Navy on, and my brother and I, we knew how to fly before we could drive our cars. I'm a former Navy pilot, flew P-3 Orions in the Navy, and gosh, for the last 20 years, I've worked for the King County Sheriff's Office, but been around the racing and Warbird scene for as long as I can remember. I'm a flight crew on Diamond Little B-24 in the 2924 Squadron, and happy to be here.
Good. What brought you to the air races the very first year? It was your dad, wasn't it?
Yeah. So my dad, he started going. Gosh, I think 1967 was the first year that he went, which was only 3 or 4 years after they started. And I started going in 1971. I was 4 years old. And that's kind of all I've known since. I've missed a few because being in the military or other commitments somewhere. So I haven't made all of them, but I've made a majority of them. And, we like to joke around that it's always fun to watch the planes go fast and loud around the pylons, but it's the people. We use the term the September family, and it really is. I've got so many friends that are really lifelong friends. And some of them I see and talk to all the time. Some of them I only see once a year, but we just pick it up right where we started. And I'm sure it's that way for, anywhere. It's the same way in flying airplanes to the squadron. You got lifelong friends out of it.
That is so true. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a big event like Reno, Oshkosh, Sun and Fun, or a small, just a kind of local air show or flying event. It's amazing. Every year you come back and there's the same people, and it's almost like you pick up the exact same conversation you started 12 months ago without skipping a beat.
That always amazed me, that I would go, I'd see somebody like Howard Pardue or Ed Maloney from the Planes of Fame Museum or something like that, and they would ask me a question that was literally the last conversation we had the year prior. And it's like, you remember that? I didn't even remember we were talking about that. But yeah, so that it's always great. They're lifelong friendships.
Excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit tonight. We're going to focus in on especially the 1970s, because that was kind of the zenith of Commemorative Air Force at that time, the Confederate Air Force participation in the air races, and most times not necessarily official CAF aircraft but CAF member-owned aircraft, but they were still kind of representing the CAF at the time. And
Sure.
of course, we're going to start with this beautiful.
I actually went back and was looking at aircraft that had participated, and I know that even in the mid to late 60s, there were pilots like Rob Kuchera flew a Bearcat, and Tom Kaczynski had a Mustang, and they were just guys that owned Warbirds in civilian paint schemes, but they were also colonels in the CAF, so they weren't necessarily there, in any kind of official capacity, but guys who flew Warbirds back in the day, they knew what the CAF was, and they wanted to be a part of it. And that kind of evolved, as you said, into the 70s. The 70s was really that zenith period that saw, it was all unofficial, but it really saw, a huge participation, a very high profile, let's call it, participation of the CAF as the races were evolving and as the Warbird movement was evolving. The organizations were kind of growing parallel, so you saw a lot of that.
Exactly. Well, we've got to start out with this gorgeous P-38.
Sure. So this was actually taken in 1970. This is Lefty Gardner's P-38, and I would hazard a guess that is probably the iconic CAF aircraft.
Yeah.
Brad Pilgrim were here. He would tell you that was never a CAF aircraft per se. Lefty owned it, and there were several ownership transfers on paperwork between Lloyd Nolan and Lefty for whatever reasons they were doing it. But so the very first year that this airplane showed up at Reno was 1970, and they, if you go to the next slide, there was another P-38 that was owned by Reva Sermon out of Louisiana, and these were two CAF affiliated aircraft, but for whatever reason, they entered at Reno, and a P-38 is not competitive. It is not a low-altitude, fast airplane, but anybody who ever saw any of the P-38s race, and there were 4 P-38s in total in the history of I'll call it Reno-era racing, they sounded unlike any other airplane that was out there. And I think that was like my favorite thing about listening when Lefty Gardner or Gary Levitz or something would fly by. That's what sticks with me is the sound. It was just this amazing snarl because they didn't have the turbochargers in them, so it was a very low altitude setup, and it was great. So anyway, 1970, and Rivas and Lefty flew their airplanes. They just flew them around in a constellation race, and nobody cared.
Yeah.
But it was kind of the introduction to the CAF. Both airplanes had Confederate Air Force on the tail boom, and it was kind of the first showing of the flag, if you will, of what the CAF was. As I said, it was not any kind of official participation, but it was certainly a great advertisement for the organization.
Oh, definitely. And as you had alluded to before, this was really the beginning of the Warbird movement itself being more organized. It started in the 60s, but really in the 70s, it starts getting into, the people are starting to recognize the value of these aircraft from a historical perspective. So you're starting to see some of the more intricate restorations coming along and things, but there's still there's still some that are carrying non-traditional paint schemes and they're just out flying for fun, and that's obviously what these guys are doing.
It still kind of had, for lack of a better term, an EAA pancake breakfast feel to it. Bring your airplane, come on, let's all get together, we're just going to go have fun. And that's not to say that the races weren't structured, not to say that they weren't run safely, it just had a very relaxed feel to it. So go ahead to the next slide if you'd like.
Sure. So
this picture was not taken at Reno. It was still in 1970, right after a month after the air races. Some guys who had been stalwarts at Reno, Darrell Greenemeyer and Chuck Hall and a couple of the other pilots, decided they wanted to take it a step further. So they actually had a 1,000-mile pylon race out of Mojave, California.
Wow.
And the idea was to have more like a car race with pit stops and things like that. And it was 66 laps around a a 15-mile course that took 3 hours to complete, 20 airplanes on the course all at the same time. It was a really cool idea. It just really didn't play out. It wasn't really conducive to racing, if you will. Now, there were some guys that put long-range tanks in it and were able to go nonstop. Clay Lacy had a DC-7 that raced nonstop, which imagine racing a DC-7 around a close quarters pylon race. Anyway, Gary Levitz was the third of the three CAF-affiliated P-38s back in the day. And in this picture, that's Gary Levitz standing in the foreground. Gary was the grandson of the founder of the Levitz Furniture Corporation. So Gary was kind of an early stalwart in the CAF. He helped get Texas Raiders, and he helped get the Gulf Coast Wing charter up and started, and was a very staunch supporter in the early days. Standing on the wing root of the airplane is Vernon Thorpe, and Vernon was also one of the big guy. I mean, he was involved in the CAF all the way through. He ended up perishing in the crash of the B-26 Marauder down at Midland, but he was all the way through. He was one of the chief pilots for the CAF, but he was also the corporate pilot for the Levitz Furniture Foundation, or Levitz Furniture Corporation. And he was the one who basically taught Gary to fly and brought Gary into the fold. So in this race, and there was another 1,000-mile race the following May in San Diego, Gary and Vernon swapped as relief pilots when they would make pit stops. They would fly back and forth. But I just found it interesting that, in 1970, I don't know how many P-38s there were flying in the world, but there couldn't have been many more than three. And all three of them were CAF affiliated, and all three of them, that was the first time that they had been raced in the Reno area. That was kind of neat.
Yeah.
Okay, go to the next slide. So Lefty Gardner, obviously the Lightning is really associated with Reno and the CAF, but after that first time in 1970, he did not come back and race that P-38 for many years. Instead, he had this polished metal P-51, didn't have a name yet. This airplane ended up being flown by his son-in-law, Joe Henderson, who was also a CAF colonel, and he also flew for Lefty's crop dusting company. In the background of that picture is a red P-63. That was a modified P-63 that Lefty was hired to fly. It was owned by John Sandberg up in Minnesota, who was also a CAF colonel. His main contribution, I'm going to say, to the Warbird movement is he was incredibly Warbird friendly, and he would sponsor aircraft, but he was an engine guy, had an engine overhaul service up there in Minnesota. He donated more engines than I can possibly remember to various CAF projects over the years. And just one of those behind-the-scenes kind of guys that you may not have had the name recognition of it, but chances are there was an airplane that you saw flying at air shows in the CAF that he had something to do with to help bring engines to, or done overhauls with, or something like that. So in 1972, excuse me, Lefty brought the P-51 and the P-63, and he and his son-in-law Joe were kind of going back and forth, and that was kind of the real introduction of Rivas and Lefty had brought the P-38s in 1970 and thought, hey, this is pretty fun. Let's do some more of that. Okay, go ahead, next one. So a lot of my focus was on the unlimited class, but this I thought was really cool. So if you look at number 72 T6 in the T6 class, has the Confederate flag on the tail there. This was flown by a gentleman named Bill Turnbull. And Bill Turnbull was one of the original 5 members that founded the CAF in 1957. So he never raced Unlimited, but he did race this T6 in the late 60s and early 70s. And in fact, he was the 1973 national champion for the T6 class in this. But I guess because the T6s don't have the high profile that the Unlimiteds do, he doesn't really get any recognition. But I thought it was kind of cool because it's one of two CAF members that high profile members that were class national champions. Okay, next. Okay, so here again, this is a better picture of the P63 Tipsy Miss that Lefty flew for John Sandberg. What's interesting about this, John Sandberg had a reputation as a tinkerer, and he loved to just try all sorts of different things. At one point, he had twin turbochargers on the Allison on Tipsy Miss that he tried to race. The airplane, in fact, was called Tipsy Miss because it was replumbed to run on alcohol instead of avgas. So they were producing a lot of horsepower with it, but they would always burn the motors up. It was a fast airplane, but they could never finish. And in fact, the only race that Lefty and John won with Tipsy Miss was a consolation race, if you will, at Mojave in 1974. After they had burned up the race motor, Ed Maloney from the Plains Plane Museum in Chino had a bone stock Allison sitting back at the shop that had not been run in years, and they literally took a pickup truck back to Chino overnight, brought the motor to Mojave, changed it, replumbed it so it ran on avgas, and he went out and won the race the next day. So I know it was a source of frustration. He tried it. They ran that airplane through 1976, and I think it was one of the few races that it actually finished. It won. So he finally said, "Yeah, this just isn't working," and it was a fun experiment to watch, but it just didn't work. Of note, in the background, Lefty's P51 is their number 25 in the background, but off to the left side, behind the nose of the P63, is a P47, and I think that may be the next slide. There we go. I know when Brad Pilgrim was doing his series on the history of the CAF, we talked about a gentleman named Ed Juris from up in New York. Ed had a Mosquito that he brought over that was part of the CAF collection, but Ed was also the guy who found the 6 P47s with the Peruvian Air Force and had them imported back, and one by one made airworthy. Now, I don't recall exactly what year they had all 6 of them flying. I think they only flew once with all 6 aircraft in the same formation. But in 1974, Lefty had said, "Hey, let's bring one of these airplanes out here." I think they were in the process of trying to sell it. That's what they were doing. But in addition to racing the P63, Lefty qualified and raced the P47 Thunderbolt, which is it is a very big. If you've ever seen a P47 fly in person, there is nothing sexy, there is nothing sleek about it at all. And if it's not an altitude, it's not very fast either. Now, it's great if it's going to go on a low-level ground attack mission. That's probably the airplane that I would want to be in a low-level ground attack mission. But as far as racing it around the pylons, this was literally just out having fun. But again, it was all part of this CAF mentality of, this is great, let's go have some fun with this. So there's only been one other P47 that has raced, David Price, who had the museum flying out in Santa Monica, but was also a member of the SoCal wing of the CAF. He had a Thunderbolt that they raced at the Phoenix Air Races in 1995 that motorcycle racer Bob Hurricane Hanna piloted. So Interesting. It's just not an airplane that you would even associate with air racing, but it was there, and it was just cool to see go around pilots.
I cannot imagine. I mean, I can imagine what it sounded like, but yeah, you're right. That's not the kind of airplane that's going to make any kind of big speed records. It's certainly not.
Not at all.
And I see there's a nice P-51 in the background of this photo as well, which is going to bring us to the next one.
Good. So Gerald Martin was also another bigwig in the CAF back in the day. If you remember from Brad Pilgrim's talks, Gerald Martin was one of the pilots that was over filming the Battle of Britain movie. And this was a Mustang that he had picked up. And again, a privately owned Mustang of his that Lefty said, come on out. You can see how serious they were. The race number is taped on with duct tape and electrical tape outline. This airplane was interesting history in that there is no formalized pylon racing in the United Kingdom, but in 1967 this airplane was flying over in England, and they have a handicap timing race called the King's Cup. Now, handicap racing is different, and it is around a longer closed course, but you fly a qualifying lap, and how fast you qualify versus the other aircraft in the field, you get a time handicap of when you are allowed to take off and start the race. And as such, you could have a Piper Cub flying against a Mustang. And the idea is that you're not allowed to race any faster. There's like a small percentage that you have to fly within the speed that you qualified at, or you get penalized. And the idea is you want all the airplanes to cross the finish line about the same time, because the guys that started first have taken the whole time to go around the course, and the guy in the Mustang goes off and flies around at 80 inches of manifold pressure and catches up really quick. So realistically, you rarely have the fast airplanes that win. It's the guys flying some weird home-built or some guy in a Piper Cherokee that might win the race. But in 1967, I don't know how he managed to do it, but I think that guy's name was Charles Mansfield, managed to win the King's Cup in this airframe. So it already had a little bit of pedigree when Gerald Martin brought the airplane here. And then in later years, in the late 70s and early 80s, anybody who went to Reno might recognize this as Bill DeStefani's Mangiapane, which was the stock airplane next to Tiger's Strega, which was the race modified plane that he flew. So this one is near and dear to my heart. This was kind of the plane that brought me a little closer into the fold, the ramp rat era of my life, if you will. This is an airplane called Precious Metal. Gary Levitz bought this airplane and had it modified as a racer. So the gentleman in the cockpit is a guy named Ralph Payne. Ralph Payne was another early CAF colonel. He had actually helped, he was involved in getting the F-82 that was up at Lackland, donated into the CAF. He also was the guy who had found and gone up to Idaho, I think it was in Boise, maybe Idaho Falls, where the Razorback P-51 that is now our Red Tail, our Rise of the Red Tail Squadron, that airplane was up there, and Ralph was the one who kind of got it airworthy and had it ferried back. Also, I was good friends with Ralph. He was kind of a mentor of mine, and that was on that trip was where he met his future wife Norma. So anytime I see the Red Tail Mustang, that's kind of Ralph's Mustang and Norma's Mustang. Just a little personal preference here. Anyway, this was the first attempt by any CAF member to really go fast. This was a 440 mile an hour modification with the typical things that you do with clipped wings and the highly modified engines, things like that. Gary was a little flamboyant. Gary obviously had some good money at his disposal. The airplane's name was Precious Metal, but if you look at the spinner, that gold spinner was actually hand-laid gold leaf. that was burnished on there. A little bit showing off. It was pretty cool. And it was great right until they ran it through the first rainstorm. And then the rain hitting it at 400 miles an hour kind of melted it and peeled it all off. So that only lasted 1 year, but it was still pretty cool. Gary only raced this for 1 year and then sold it. Ralph told me at one point that he felt that they built an airplane that was faster than what Gary was comfortable going at that point. But this airplane was sold to a CAF colonel named Don Whittington down in Florida. And this airplane actually made a couple of appearances at air show in Harlingen and participated in the Warbird part of the air show when Don flew the airplane. So it still had, even though it was a real racer, it had a good CAF finish. So this airplane was owned by a gentleman named Bill Hubbs, who was the mayor of Waco, Texas, but he was also a CAF colonel. And this was another, hey, come on along, let's go fly the airplane. So this was, I think this airplane raced in 1975 and in 1977, just as an also ran, let's go out and have fun. Bill Hubbs didn't race it, but you can see it has the CAF flag on the tail, and it says Confederate Air Force on the fuselage. Joe Henderson raced it in 1975, and Vernon Thorpe raced it in 1977. Just a little interesting story about a lot of these guys, even though maybe a particular pilot was entered, they didn't necessarily stay in that airplane. You would have guys that would shuffle back and forth. It was all the CAF pilots. Well, who do you want to fly it today? Hey, I got to overdo this. Why don't you fly it? Well, and I'll do it again tomorrow. So there was a lot of musical chairs. Okay, this is one of my favorite stories. So this airplane originally was Bob Hoover's first aerobatic Mustang. He did it all through the 1960s and then through the early 70s. This was his primary aerobatic performer. Had an accident where they overfueled the oxygen tanks and it was damaged. So Hoover got a new airplane, but this airplane was repaired. And at this point, it was owned by a colonel named John Stokes. And John Stokes was out of the Central Texas wing up in San Marcos. At any given time, the Stokes Air Force had a Sea Fury and a B-25 and a couple of the Tora planes, and he had all sorts of stuff. He had a Corsair for a while. That Corsair that ended up being flown in Baba Black Sheep in the TV series and such. But in this case, they convinced him to bring the airplane to Reno, and Vernon Thorpe was going to run the airplane. But it was a very stock Mustang, stock engine. They had no hope of going fast whatsoever. So Ralph Payne, who was the crew chief for Gary Levitz's Mustang, said, hey, I got an idea. I think we can hook something up here. So if you look in the back seat, you can see a green garbage can that is sitting right behind Vernon Thorpe. If you go to the next slide, Ralph and Vernon went to the local hardware store. They bought a 20-gallon garbage can and a few feet of copper tubing. And then they found an extra fuel pump, and they plumbed that into the fuel system to run ADI injection, which is anti-detonation. It's like an alcohol water mix that helps take the induction temperature down and lets you run at a higher manifold pressure, get more horsepower without over-temping the engine. So they literally Rube Goldberged this contraption together, and they belted it into the back seat and went off to fly the medallion race, which Vernon actually was leading for about 5 laps. And then they ran out of water. And then the temperature spiked, and he had to pull back on the throttle, and everybody passed him, and he ended up finishing, I think, like 4th. But in In the pit area, Gary Levitz had this thing they called the Ramp Rat Report, which was just this big chalkboard that had all sorts of snarky remarks, and they're all good-natured, but just observation, everybody ribbing each other, things like that. And the next day, there was a thing that I think said, like, Uncle Vernon said, I didn't need a bigger engine, I just needed a bigger garbage can. And if you didn't know what the joke was, you wouldn't get it. But this is actually one of my favorite pictures because, I mean, the grin on Vernon's face kind of says it all. It's just, let's go have some fun, right? And that's kind of the spirit of this time frame. That's the spirit of the CAF at Reno. All right. So Lefty painted his P-51, and maybe a lot of people will recognize this P-51 now. Gave it kind of a pseudo USAF Thunderbirds paint scheme, even though the Thunderbirds never flew P-51s. They never flew any piston-powered aircraft. They were a jet-only team. But in 1976, it had a brand new paint job, and they went out and they made the final heat, and all the fast guys broke. So the saying, you know, in air racing or in any kind of racing, to finish first you have to finish. The top three guys all pulled out or were penalized, and there was Lefty chugging along a half a lap behind, and he crossed the finish line, and lo and behold, he's the winner. You know, I've heard guys say that it felt like the guy who brought a pickup truck to the Indy 500 and came away with the trophy, but he's still the winner. Now, on a personal note, if you see down there on the bottom, it says Colonel Murray Vaughn, crew chief. I have not talked to Murray Vaughn in a long, long time, but I grew up flying my dad's Navion, and Murray Vaughn owned a Navion. He had come to some of our Navion fly-ins. And about the time that I really became aware of the CAF, I was still a young guy, but this is about time that, I don't know, there's probably a bunch of people my age that remember Boys Life magazine for the Cub Scouts. Boys Life magazine had a couple of issues that featured the CAF. And that was really my introduction of, wow, I want to get involved in that. How do I figure out, and I'm up in Seattle, so, you know, I was a bit of ways away from that. But around this time, Murray Vaughn showed up at one of our fly-ins, and he had the 16 millimeter film of the Ghost Squadron that was produced shortly after the 72 Transpo show that Brad Pilgrim had talked about in his history of the CAF. And I can remember watching that, and I mean, my eyes were the size of saucers, and my jaw was just like, I didn't even know that these guys existed. How do I get involved in that? So I can point and thank to Murray Vaughn. I have no idea if Murray Vaughn is still around, but I can thank him for being here today, because he was kind of the impetus that really opened that door and showed me what the CAF was and what it could be. So that same year in 1976, Lefty had brought the P-38 back to Reno, but up until this time, he'd only been doing the aerobatic routine that he did with it. He was racing several other airframes, but he'd bring the P-38 and was part of the show. And you know, anybody who ever saw Lefty fly that show, it was as graceful as it was impressive. You know, he would do feather an engine, or I don't think he ever feathered both engines at any point, but it's one of the things that I remember. It imprinted on me at a very early age. Well, that year they had a low number of entries in the unlimited class, so they said, hey, why don't you just slap a race number on the P-38 and go racing? And again, it was slow, but it didn't matter. So from 1976 onward, Lefty flew the P-38 every year, I want to say up through 1996. So a 20-year span where he ran that P-38. And it was never fast, but it was always the plane that everybody pulled for because it was so iconic looking, but it was great to watch P-38 go around the race course.
And of course, as you mentioned before, they spared no expense in the race number there. I can already see the 13 is starting to peel off.
And it's funny because I'm kind of anal as a nerd. You know, I can go and recognize what color tape they used or what, you know, each year. Oh, that's 1976 because of the way that they taped it on there. Now later on, maybe they'd tape it on early in the week, but then they'd take some water-based paint and actually paint a race number on the nose. But it was always gone by the end of the week. So, because, you know, by the time the airplane, this races are always in September, and by the time we had air show at Harlingen, you know, like 3 weeks later, the race number was gone.
Yep.
So 1976 was also the first year that the CAF brought the Tora 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 routine to me. And back in the day when gas was cheaper, you could afford to really bring the whole Tora Tora routine. It wasn't just the Japanese replicas that the show has now. They bring the Wildcat, they bring a P-40. This was Ed Messick's P-39 that he had, which was, again, it wasn't the P-39 that the CAF had, but it was sponsored by 3 CAF colonels, and it was part of the CAF fleet at the time. And they brought the B-17, so they did the full single engine or the single wheel landing and everything, full Tora Tora routine at Reno, which went over huge. Everybody loved it. But because they were short on airplanes, they twisted Ed's arm and said, hey, why don't you enter the P-39? Well, again, a P-39 is not necessarily the thing that you associate with going fast at Reno. P-39 won the first race in the Cleveland races back in 1946, but it was highly modified. This airplane was not, but it did have a racing connection in that in the early 70s, this airplane was owned by Meyer Slovak. And Meyer's claim to fame was, you know, he was a hydroplane racer, but he had also defected from Czechoslovakia to West Germany with a DC-3 and became actually a very famous celebrity in the United States because of that. But he also was a pilot for TWA and he raced hydroplanes. But he also had a P-39 that was sponsored by the Menon Speedstick Corporation that they had prepped for racing. And it flew for several years in the Menon race colors, but they always had mechanical problems with it and were never able to get it qualified. So Meyer sold the airplane shortly, late 1975 maybe, and it happened to be part of the CAF Toro routine. So it had some racing pedigree to it, and brought it. And that was, I'm pretty sure that was the last P-39 that was run in competition was in 1976 with Ed Messick.
Wow.
So this is Gary Levitz's P-38 again. We saw it earlier with the picture of him and Vernon Thorpe when it was still all bare metal. If you look, Gary's kind of funny. We know that the P-38 is not a fast airplane, but he really wanted to beat Lefty. So this airplane actually has a pair of clipped wings on it, and he had that's an F-80 Shooting Star nose that he has on it, which was actually interchangeable with the P-38. So when he had the airplane at the CAS shows, he had stock wingtips and a gun nose on it. But when he raced it, he had clipped wings and a race nose on it. I don't think it got him anything, but you know, it made him feel racy, and everybody loved the little competition that they had going on between each other. So there was about maybe an 8 or 9 year period where Gary and Lefty had the two P-38s that would fly together on the race course every year, and they were always about the same speed, so they were always on the race course together. So, but I always liked that little paint job that he had on shark mouth. No self-respecting P-38 ever looked like that, but I certainly enjoyed it. Here again, this was in 1977. And this was another CAF affiliated airplane. Now, by 1977, you're starting to kind of get in that era where stock Warbirds aren't in civilian schemes anymore. You know, they are, unless they're racing, they're in pseudo Warbird schemes, and I'll say pseudo because, boy, if you look at some of those Warbird restorations from the 1970s, the paint jobs are they're interesting to say the least. But it was it was an evolution, right? We're going in the right direction. But at the time, this was one of the few civilian painted stock Mustangs that was still around. A colonel named Gerald Baker had it, and the guy that flew it was a colonel named Tom Summers, who was a Formula One pilot. We raced the little home-built Formula One pilots, or Formula One aircraft around the smaller courses and stuff. So again, this was hey, let's bring the airplane and tape a race number on it with duct tape, and we'll just go fly it. So Ed Messick, the guy who had the P-39 the previous year, bought a Mustang in 1977, and I wish I had a good color picture of it that showed off what I'm trying to show here. It was restored in Texas Air National Guard markings. It was called Minutemen because the Minutemen was the squadron for the Texas Air National Guard. It was absolutely stunning post-war markings, and it was one of my favorite Warbird paint schemes back in the day. So Ed brought that airplane to race in the Unlimiteds in 1977. But if you look, he's wearing a gorilla mask. So I do not know the full story behind what brought that on, but every time he would start the airplane up and taxi it out and taxi it back, he'd be waving at the crowd wearing this gorilla mask, and then when he'd get down to the run-up, he'd take it off and put his headset on and helmet on and go run. There was a book that was published in the mid-'80s called Gray Eagles, which was a fictitious book about the CAF, about a ex-Luftwaffe pilot who decided he was going to exact his revenge on the United States by restoring a group of MU-109s and going out and finding the pilots who had shot him down in the war, who also happened to be CAF pilots in the book. Well, one of the CAF pilots, as they were flying to an air show, was described as flying the air show in his gorilla mask, which was a direct. Not when I read that, I'm like, oh my God, that was what Ed Messick did at Reno. So I always thought that was kind of cute. I wish I knew more of the backstory. Ed passed away here several years ago, so the background may have died with it. Brad Pilgrim I might have a text right here waiting for Brad to tell me the backstory. That can be a follow-up maybe, but I just thought that was kind of here again, we're having fun with the group.
Right.
So again, the CAF brought the Toro routine, the entire Toro routine, to Reno in 1977. And this time, Gerald Martin again. Gerald Martin was the Wildcat pilot for the Toro routine, and he was convinced to enter the Wildcat in the races. Now, if there's an airplane that is slower on the race course than a P-47, it's an FM2 Wildcat. If you've ever seen a Wildcat fly, it's like you push the throttle forward and set it, and it just chugs around all day. It's slow enough that there was a guy in later years that would race the Wildcat, a Wildcat there, with the canopy open, and he'd wave at the guy's pylon as he went by, because he's not really going fast. But what's of note of this is, and I know you and I had a conversation about this before, the CAF has never condoned their aircraft being raced at Reno. And Leah Block had pointed out that, it's actually in writing in the bylaws that no CAF aircraft will be raced. And up until that point, all the other guys that had raced, all the other CAF planes were just affiliated. They're colonels, but it was private aircraft that were owned. In this case, the Wildcat was owned by the CAF. How that worked, I don't know. But it was one of two times that an actual CAF aircraft was raced in in the air races. Now, a few years ago, I know the Southern California wing had made noise about entering their Bearcat and their Hellcat, and Jason Soames and Steve Barber had gone through the motion of they'd gone to the pylon racing school and gotten qualified as pilots, and when they went to confirm it with headquarters, headquarters said, "Oh, you can't do that."
Yeah.
So, for the record, the only other, we can just go back for one thing, the only other person, because if he's listening, I know he will say something, Michael Flieger, in 2017, I believe, had the Wildcat that is now with the Arizona wing, Air Base Arizona. He flew that in the bronze class at Reno too. And I think that was something that kind of slipped in underneath the radar. I'm not sure if headquarters, I'm not pointing fingers, I don't know the backstory, but I think it kind of slipped in. But that was what got the Southern California wing to want to bring their planes the following year and do it. But I've always found it kind of funny that the two actual CAF airplanes that flew were the slowest in the field.
Yep.
So again, in 1977, this P-40, I believe this P-40 was owned by maybe Max Hoffman at the time, but it was part of the Toro routine there. And Colonel Walt Eskridge, who was also in the 70s a big name in the headquarters staff. He flew this around the back end of the race, the back end of the race course with Gerald Martin in the FM2 Wildcat. Now, what is kind of interesting is not that which heat race it was, but trophy race number 2 in 1977, which was kind of a fill-in race, if you will. It didn't really count for anything, but there were 7 airplanes that were entered in that. 6 of the airplanes that were entered in the race were all CAF affiliated airplanes. So it was literally a bunch of buddies, of flying buddies, all going out in the same heat and just running around together. And that included both of the P-38s and the Wildcat and the Mustang. And so that, to me, that's the high watermark of the CAF involvement. Was it had six CAF affiliated airplanes in the same heat.
Wow.
So kind of talked a little bit earlier about, there was this little friendly rivalry between Gary Levitz and Lefty Gardner and their P-38s. Gary obviously had a lot of money at his disposal, and he took pride in that. Lefty did not. So typically, Lefty's airplane would show up on these old, tired Allison engines, and oil would be dripping down the cowlings, and it was truly run what you brung. And one year, Gary went to John Sandberg and said, "I want you to make me 2 race Allisons to go in my airplane." So they took the G6, which was the kind of the most powerful version of the Allison, and he made 2 G6s for Gary's plane, and they went out, and Lefty beat him. And Gary just threw a tantrum in the pits. Now, it was a good-natured tantrum, but he's throwing stuff around, and I remember him screaming, "I just hate these problems that you can't solve with money." And I thought that was the funniest thing that I'd heard. And, of course, Lefty's probably just sitting over there chuckling away. I don't want to say that Lefty was a better pilot than Gary, but the race results kind of speak for themselves. I think in all the years that they raced together, Gary only beat Lefty once.
Wow.
And what I remember about that is when he did, as he pulled up off the course after casing the checkered flag, he did a couple of slow rolls, or a couple of aileron rolls, for his victory rolls, because it was the only time he managed to beat Lefty. So I thought that was kind of fun. So I threw this in here because the airplane, the P-38s were nice and slow, and Lefty was a crop duster. He's very comfortable flying close to the ground. There is a minimum altitude that you can fly at Reno, and it's typically you can't fly, your cockpit can't be lower than the top of the can at the pylon, and I think it's the letter R in Reno at the home pylon. If you fly lower than that, you get disqualified. Out on the back side of the race course, most people can't see this, but there's some interesting topography. This picture was taken on the old Pylon 6, which was up on a ridge, and you approached it and you dove down off the ridge down into the Valley of Speed to come back to the front stretch of the race course. Well, Lefty would take that turn pretty low. And in 1981, which is when this picture was taken, during one of the heat races, he pulled back into the pit area and shut down, and there was a piece of fence post sticking out of his left wingtip that he had managed to snag as he went by. Now, he wasn't disqualified, so I don't think anybody actually saw him do it, but the evidence was there, and he had a crunched wingtip to show for it, and I remember them banging it back out, and he went out and flew the next day. But again, you see some pretty iconic pictures from the photographers like Bucky Dawson and Neil Nurmi, who were the photographers that I associate with back in that era of Reno. And this picture is about as high as Lefty ever got. So, as I said, Lefty was always one of my favorite guys to watch run. It was sad when that airplane stopped racing, but I will say this: that airplane is now flying with the Flying Bulls with Red Bull over in Austria, and Nelson Ezell restored it for them, and it is in better condition than Lefty ever had it. And I saw the thing fly here a handful of years ago, and it was every bit as stunning as you can imagine. And my brother pointed out that all you had to do was pull up the music that Lefty used to do his aerobatic routine to, and it was right there. So I know Lefty had to be smiling down on it. I know a lot of people were upset that the CAF didn't manage to keep that airplane, and they feel it should have been kept in that red, white, and blue scheme and stuff, but I can tell you that it is, every time that airplane flies, it is a memorial to Lefty. Very well done. So as we transitioned out of the 70s, the CAF official participation kind of tapered off. But we had a new generation of CAF guys come in and take their place. Jim Orton, who was the chief pilot for the Arizona wing for the CAF and their chief pilot for Sentimental Journey, he raced John Sandberg's Mustang. Howard Pardue, who was out of Breckenridge, Texas, he's a big supporter. He had several Corsairs and a Wildcat and a TBM Avenger, and that always flew, in the CAF shows. But they also hosted the Big Iron Show at Breckenridge, which was kind of a really big Texas-based Warbird show, a CAF affiliated show in the 80s and such. So Howard started bringing his F8, F1 Bearcat, which was, to me, is every bit as iconic, as watching Lefty fly the P-38. Howard was always there. He was never particularly fast, but it was just Howard. And in the background, you'll see a B-25 sitting there. For some reason, in the early to mid 80s, guys got it in their mind that, hey, wouldn't it be fun to bring a B-25 or an A-26 or something like that and just run it around and qualify? Now, I happen to think that they probably did it they paid their entry fee just so they could get a dozen pit passes and have a really good view, sit up on top of the wing and watch the race. But that's Bill Arnott's B-25 Silver Lady, which, again, was affiliated with CAF and kind of part of the Breckenridge gang and stuff. And he actually brought that airplane out a couple of years. They never qualified it, but it was always fun to watch a B-25 run around the race course. So like I said, during that era, you had, kind of that Breckenridge gang picked up the CAF marquee. Nelson Ezell would fly, and in later years, Stu Dawson, who has the Spirit of Texas Sea Fury, he kind of, they were the guys that were kind of holding that CAF affiliated torch as we moved on from that golden era. Okay, so I would be remiss if I left this out. Our current CAF Director of Maintenance, Matt Jackson. Hi, Matt, if you're listening. Matt Jackson started racing at Reno, I want to say in 1991. But he has a very interesting distinction in that he has managed to not just fly, but race a majority of the highly modified racers that have ever run at Reno. He's run in Stiletto and Strega and Voodoo, both of the R4360 powered C Furies. If it's a Rare Bear, he raced the Rare Bear 1 year too. So that it's to me that's kind of an amazing thing that he has had the opportunity to fly so many of those airplanes in the races. This was him coming back from a test run, an early morning test run, 2013, flying Built to Stephanie Strega. So he kind of picked up in the 2000s, was kind of running the CAF flag for us, if you will. So I just threw in a couple of slides of the CAF tour routine. This is from 1977 with Van Skiles doing the one wheel pass down the runway. There were like 3 different CAF affiliated P40s that were in the show that year, and this is yet another one. Again, Brad Pilgrim could probably tell me who owned that one. I do not know who owned that particular airplane. I just know it's ended up in the markings of Robert L. Scott, who wrote the God Is My Co-Pilot book. But again, these were guys that were just out having fun, and it made a big impression on the guys at Reno. So if you go to the next slide, in the late 70s, early 80s, the Arizona wing brought Sentimental Journey out. And this is Jim Orton running the B-17 around the pylons. Now, they weren't racing, but that's at pylon height. So he is, he's only 100 feet in the air, wrapping that B-17 around the race course. Always just a eye-opening sight to see something that big being flown that well around the race course. So that's kind of my lasting memory of Jim Orton, who sadly passed away in 1983 in a crash of the P-22. But I'm going to throw this in because Jason Soames, who is out with the SoCal wing of the CAF, for several years, he raced in the Formula One class. And this airplane, he did not win with this airplane, but this airplane had a very winning pedigree. And gosh, I want to say it probably won 5 or 6 times at Reno under various owners and stuff. I don't know if the airplane has been repaired and is racing today, but anyway, he's another one that is not in the unlimited class, but racing in the smaller classes and still kind of upholding the CAF flag for us.
Certainly. Well, Brad, you have shared some just wonderful photos with us, but we've saved maybe the best for last. And that is, why don't you set this video clip up for us?
Sure. Well, I will apologize for the quality of this. This was just taken with a little 8mm camcorder for me. But in 1997, the B-29, B-24 squadron bought both bombers out just to be put on display because I don't believe they were doing ride flights at that point in time. So they just had the airplanes out at the races on display, and it was either Friday night or Saturday night of race week, the bombers and a T-28 and a couple other airplanes took off to go kind of promote the races by doing a flyby over downtown Reno. And I think, after hours at Reno, if you've been there for any length of time, you know that after hours is the best time because that's when, it's not true, but that's when the FAA has gone home. So that's when they sell, everybody's selling rides and guys are just out, hey, let's go flying. So there's all sorts of activity that goes on. So if you stick around for, until the sun sets, you get to see some pretty amazing things. And all these airplanes had gone off, they'd taken off, they'd flown over downtown Reno, and we weren't thinking about it. We were just watching all the other stuff flying. And the next thing we know, coming down the chute is the B-29 and the B-24 in formation with a T-28 camera ship kind of flying off the wing, and they dropped down on the race course.
Let's take a look.
And coming off the 5 into pylon 6, it's Fifi in the lead with Diamond Low closing on the outside. If they come clear around, that'll be a beautiful shot. And down into the valley of speed they come. Oh, pylon cut! That is so cool.
Yeah, they're going, Look at that thing.
Dad, you keep the wonderful. I just ran out of filming too many of the times.
727.
I can say this, that, you know, being a part of that squadron today and flying those airplanes today, I can't even imagine. You know, my brother is one of Fifi's pilots, and I haven't asked him directly, but I think he would just do an no way, just no way. I'm not going to be flying that airplane that close to the ground like that, you know. But here again, you know, it wasn't operating unsafely, but just like, wow.
Yeah.
So that was one of my favorite Reno moments right there, was being there to see that.
Well, and it's amazing too. That you said there was originally 8mm film, and then transferred to video.
Or yeah, just home video.
Not like today, where you can just take out your cell phone.
Somebody has to have pictures of that from the back of the T-28, because I know it was a photo mission. So
Sure.
I don't know if those have ever seen the light of day or not. Maybe they were just having too much fun to actually, that they actually had the camera in their lap or something. I don't know.
Who knows? Who knows what we'll find in the archives? I'll bet Brad Pilgrim has something.
Sure.
Well, Brad Haskin, any final thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
No, happy to be here. Always have, racing's been a part of my life, and I it's probably one of my faults, but I like talking about racing too. So.
Oh, we'll have you back anytime to talk more about the races, and you have a great memory and a great archive of all sorts of things, not just CAF, but I understand also with all the other categories of races that have taken place at Reno.
I've probably got a photo archive of about 30,000 photos. So
good. We can probably get through those in, I don't know, 3-4 hours, right?
Sure thing.
Again, thanks, Brad, for being here, and thank you to everybody for sticking around. Hope you enjoyed the show. I certainly did. Boy, it's amazing when Brad was talking about some of those names of pilots. Boy, it just brings back a lot of memories and history of the commemorative and Confederate Air Force. CAF really has got a great history. So anyway, again, thank you for joining us tonight. Again, don't forget to click that like or subscribe button and follow us on all the different social media platforms, and click the bell icon on YouTube, and make sure you get notifications when our new episodes are posted. All right. If you have any thoughts about future topics you'd like us to cover, just send Leah Black an email at cafhq.org, and or if you have some feedback on any of the shows that we've got, we'd certainly like to hear from you. So until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.